onto my computer. Okay, that's more of a sure thing. All right. Thank you so much, Pamela. And thank you particularly, Pamela. We're all very fortunate to have you around because you are continuing to create so many wonderful Dharma opportunities for all of us. And this winter school is just a lovely weekend. And it's lovely to see some of your faces there. I recognize some of the names. If people are I don't know what the standard is for the winter school, but if people are allowed and comfortable to turn your video on, it would be lovely to see you, but there's, it's not necessary. Also just to note, Susanna and Andreas and Tazi, I was just going to note your little cartoon there about the two fish. It says that they're still searching. There's a fish saying, "I'm tired of searching for the ocean," which is very in theme with the talk I'm going to share with you. That's a great little cartoon. These ways that are just simple and like human that bring it back. So I'm going to talk today about a particular nunnery and just share some stories from that nunnery. The nunnery is called Gebchak Nunnery or Gebchak Gompa, and it's in Eastern Tibet. It's a practice lineage nunnery, so they practice full time. They're not much of philosophical scholars. And the point, the kind of what I'm hoping to get across here is just some inspiration and just what they can remind us of how it's just these stories can really sort of simplify Buddha nature and really bring it home to each of us in our situation. So, the nunnery that we'll share here and the way that they practice and the way that they live, it's maybe not necessarily the way that we should all be practicing, or certainly probably not very realistic for most of us in the worlds that we live in to be practicing that way. But nevertheless, they can really point very closely to something that's very at home in all of us. So I'm going to share my screen and just share a slideshow throughout my talk. I'll talk for share the sound. I will talk for about 45 minutes or maybe a bit longer. We'll see how it goes. And then I'm very happy to take questions at the end, or even if you have any really kind of salient questions during the talk, just pop them in the chat. You can also put up your digital hand and I'll try to notice and answer them. But otherwise, we can really have a chat about it all at the end. So put any questions you have in the chat. Okay, so I am going to move the toolbar so I can access. There we go. Just bear with me. I'm trying to get the slideshow to go full screen. There we go. And slideshow play. There we go. Okay. So just to set us sort of on the map of where this nunnery is, it's in Nangchen. And I'm sure probably all of you, if not many of you, have heard of Nangchen and maybe even heard of Gebchak Nunnery. It's quite well known. There's a chapter that talks about it in Blazing Splendor. It's got a website. There's a couple of documentaries that have featured the nunnery. They're quite extraordinary nuns. It's located in southern Nangchen, which is in present-day Qinghai province. So from about 1959, when this area was assimilated into the modern Chinese state, it's now it's within Qinghai province, and it's administered by Yushu Prefecture. And so that's a picture of China and then a picture of the nunnery. So, just to kind of place it also historically. So for many of us, we're participating in kind of like a sort of a pan-Tibetan Buddhism. Here we are in Australia and the Western world in the 21st century. Tibetan Buddhism, in many cases, is going through a lot of changes. It's adapting very rapidly to a modern world, in some cases going through reforms. And then we are educated in this very modern sort of paradigm of knowledge and coming to Vajrayana and integrating these practices in our life. So when we're talking about Gebchak Nunnery, it's really a nunnery that represents the old world of Tibet. So Nangchen, up until, again, the 1959, it was a kingdom, kind of in northern Kham, a neighbor to Derge, and it was very active in the Rime movement. So like Chugyur Lingpa was born and raised in Nangchen, and many lineages and retreats and hermitages and sacred places were established across Nangchen during that Rime period in the 18th and 19th centuries in eastern Tibet. And the way of life in Nangchen was predominantly pastoral or nomadic. So almost every family would have herds of yak and sheep, and they might farm some fields, but it was quite a high altitude society and a very earth-based economy. And kind of it revolved around the monasteries as the centers of knowledge and the centers of value. And so the lay people would often, donate, material value to the nunnery, to the monasteries and nunneries to support their spiritual lives. And then there would be an exchange of psychological, spiritual, moral, and tantric empowering support to political power. But because of the way of life being so earth-based, and the government, so it was a kingdom, but the government was quite decentralized, and it was sort of in tandem with monastic land holding and power. And it was also kind of buffeted between often Chinese dynasties and Central Tibetan dynasties, whatever they were at the time. So it was a kingdom, but it wasn't entirely autonomous politically. So the center of power was quite scattered. And it meant for the people of Nangchen that they lived sort of quite freely, fairly freely, and they also were very earth-based. So it allowed for these access, kind of an easier access to these Vajrayana attitudes of faith and pure perception. And I think it's worth noting, how much easier it would have been for Tibetans to practice pure perception than it is for us in the modern world, because of all of those very subtle levels of conditioning in the mind that came through every element of the world that they live in, including their families, the education systems, the symbols, the landscape, their economy. Every level of life would have actually allowed it to, supported the worldview, would have supported your training and your attitudes in Vajrayana. So another thing about Nangchen was that, along with being predominantly nomadic and herding, they were also predominantly practice lineage communities. So the monasteries, the nunneries were at least 80% Kagyu and Nyingma, and often were kind of modeled as more like a hermitage than a modern day monastery. So a practice lineage traditionally, and that's going back to sort of pre-1980s. A practice lineage was really based on liturgical and contemplative training, and the highest learning principle was the oral instructions of a qualified master. And the logic of the expansion of a practice lineage was the mastery of tantric practice. So we talk about Tibetan Buddhist schools. We've got your Gelugpa and Kagyu and Sakya and Nyingma, which are really more kind of matters of institutional organization, sometimes tenet systems. But when we're talking about lineage is much more that transmission of practice. So it would be the transmission of the Lamdre practice knowledge, or maybe the 6 yogas of Naropa. When we're talking about Gebchak Nunnery, they're really practicing an adaptation of the Ratnalingpa termas, so mostly in a Nyingma practice style within a kind of Dzogchen, hermeneutic, kind of a Dzogchen orientation, practicing a lot of Drupchen. So the nunnery does 19 to 20 Drupchens every year. And a Drupchen, as many of you know, are these extended group sadhana ceremonies where they're practicing a particular meditational deity or a mandala of deities, a lot of creative visualization, a lot of concentration, chanting, ritual instruments, sometimes costumes, a bit of dancing, and often periods of sort of Dzogchen meditation. And for these nuns, a bit of the Tsalung yoga, the breathing yogas as well. So they're really charged, energetically very charged, creative practices of Tantra that these nunneries were doing. And in fact, most of the communities, the monastic communities and the hermitage communities in Nangchen would have spent many days of the year doing Drupchens, probably up to 10 or 15 Drupchens a year. That was quite typical for a Kagyu or a Nyingma community. And prior to the Cultural Revolution, you had only one scholastic center in Nangchen, only one shedra. So a shedra is the Tibetan word for kind of commentarial study college. So of course, Tibetan Buddhism, its touchstone are these traditions from India, and their scholarship really was sourced in Nalanda, Odantapuri, these ancient Indian Mahayana and Vajrayana monasteries. And they're taking those original Indian texts and commentaries. And then, of course, the Tibetans have made many commentaries over the centuries. So the scholastic system of Tibet would be studying these commentaries mostly. But it was only one college like that in Nangchen prior to the Cultural Revolution. And that was at Chugyen Trungpa's monastery, the name of which escapes me at the moment. But the point here is, again, that it was much more of a kind of hermitage model for these large monasteries. So they were structured and they had different divisions, but it was the principle was one of much more about practice. It was a practical way of learning. And then it also really kind of engendered this Rime culture, which values lamas and experience, the mastery of practice experience from any lineage. So the wall of this nun's room here, again, you can see lineages, all different lineages represented on that wall. And the nuns would go and receive transmissions from lamas from different lineages and communities. So this is a picture, an aerial view of the picture of Gebchak Nunnery. It's very remote, it's at 4,500 meters. And this picture was taken in 2006. It's since developed. It's got a new main temple at the center there, and there's some more buildings. They've attempted to build a school up on top of the hill, but there's some sort of political reasons why that's has some obstacles. But because of its remoteness and also the sort of dignity these nuns have and the lamas of the nunnery have for their tradition, they've pretty much opted out of the very rapid modernization that Tibetan Buddhism has gone through on the plateau since the 1980s. So after the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong passed away and Deng Xiaoping took over, and there was that period of open and reform in China, across China, which allowed for a revival of religions. And the Tibetan Buddhism revived very quickly and with a lot of energy. And you saw a huge resurgence of monasteries, and the population of monks and nuns just burgeoned in the 1980s and 90s. So Gebchak Nunnery was reestablished at that time. The nuns themselves, along with local nomads, their families, and the lamas, they actually hand rebuilt the nunnery with the help of animals. They actually reestablished the nunnery themselves. And there were about 60 nuns that had survived the Cultural Revolution and would have been in maybe their 60s or 70s at this point, that returned to help reestablish the tradition of the nuns. So what you've seen happen is quite a modernization of Tibetan Buddhism. So really, since the 1980s, Tibet has so rapidly modernized. It's quite stunning, actually. It's almost like they've gone through the Industrial Revolution and the age of information, the digital revolution, within like 30 years. And you see, and the forces behind that are, of course, globalization, modern science, science as the highest principle of learning now. And of course, the Chinese state, which is socialist by ideology and thereby materialist. And the education system in China is now mandated for all children. So all children across China, which includes all of the Tibetan children, now they must go to 9 years of state schools, which is a good thing. However, the context of education in China is one oriented to keeping, a harmonious, unified China, and to one of economic materialist principles. So it's really training them to become, market actors and to be successful in the economy. And the way that you see and then there's some control of information in the monasteries as well. So the way you see the Tibetan Buddhist communities adapting to this is quite marvelous, actually. They've really been quite successful, but the main tactic that they've done that by is by reorientating themselves to a degree-orientated scholastic approach to Buddhism, because their sponsorship is largely from modern Han Chinese audiences who are quite skeptical. So they need to be able to teach them and respond to them and give them value according to modern science and rational learning. There's also the requirements of the government for which religion is legal, but superstition is illegal. And superstition is partly defined as that which cannot be explained scientifically. So you see great monasteries like Ladungar, and pretty much any large Kagyu or Nyingma monastery in Tibet now has a major Shedra at the heart of its program. And of course, in India and Nepal, we'll see this as well. So the Shedra model has really become the predominant model of modern Tibetan Buddhism, even across practice lineages. So that shift is very obvious in Nangchen, where, like I was describing before, they used to be mostly hermitages, doing a lot of drupchens, ritual, tantric yidam, and the kind of pith instructions and a lot of ritual practices throughout the day. That shift is really obvious. But Gebchak Nunnery is kind of opted out of, has really opted out of that. It's been influenced by conditions, but they haven't changed their yearly schedule. So at Gebchak Nunnery, they do, again, about 19 or 20 drupchens per year. And if you count the days of all of those, that's almost half of the year that they're doing drupchens. They also do daily, yidam practices. They do a lot of the tsalung, or the subtle body yogas, based on the prana and nadi yogic system of the mind body. And this is all within the kind of Nyingma Ratnalingpa Terma system, which has that Dzogchen orientation. And of course, it's one holistic tradition of practice. And they haven't changed their schedule throughout the year, that they're still maintaining that, which is quite unusual actually in Eastern Tibet nowadays. And so just to enter the nunnery here and to tell you a bit about the nuns and how they join. So the nuns today, there are about 200 to 300 Gebchak nuns, and they're mostly about 50 years old. And because they would have joined, most of them joined in the late 1970s, then the 1980s, a few in the 1990s. And many of them, when you ask them why they joined the nunnery, they explained that they had older sisters or cousins or aunts in the nunnery that they would come to visit on their holidays. And it just looked fun. Like they would join a drupchen and they were, the instruments and like sometimes the hats, a bit of dancing and all these nuns together, learning, reading. And it just looked fun to them. Also because this nunnery was patronized by the kings of Nangchen, it had a very prestigious reputation. So the Gebchak Nunnery was founded in 1892 by Tsayen Gyamtso, who was a heart disciple of Drupwang Tsoknyi Rinpoche, the first Tsoknyi Rinpoche. And Tsoknyi Rinpoche transmitted specifically to Tsayen Gyamtso Ratnalingpa, and he directly directed him to establish a community for women because there was none at the time. There was no large training center for women or nuns in Eastern Tibet. And men, of course, men and women had equal Buddha nature and potential, but women were denied opportunities at the time. And therefore, he directed Tsayen Gyamtso, who established Gebchak Nunnery, and also about a dozen other nunneries in his lifetime. And it went on, Tsayen Gyamtso and his disciples went on to establish a community of about 40 plus branch gompas, mostly nunneries of Gebchak across Eastern Tibet. So they go all the way from Rinpoche and Nangchen all the way down to Pemako. And they're mostly nunneries, but there are actually 3 large monasteries that are branches of Gebchak. So Gebchak is considered the mother nunnery. And you've got these 3 large monasteries that are branches, which is totally unprecedented in Tibetan Buddhism because nunneries were really almost always an annex of the monastery and were sort of second class. Nuns would often be denied the higher tantric practices. At Gebchak Nunnery, they were given access to the entire program. And they would also be called upon by Nangchen kings to do long life empowerment rituals for the kings. And they were patronized by the kingdom. So it had a very good reputation. So often families would encourage their daughters to join the nunnery as well. If they had a daughter that they wanted to become a nun, Gebchak Nunnery was the go-to nunnery for a couple of decades there after the Cultural Revolution. Today, you've actually got quite a few nunneries that have been established in Eastern Tibet, large nunneries. They're mostly study centers, and that's part of the kind of modernization, which has, advantages, many advantages, as well as some disadvantages for practice lineages. So the nuns would have entered the nunnery. Most of the nuns would have entered the nunnery when they were about 14 or 15 years old. The first thing they do is look after the yak. So even the nunnery would have had about 200 yak. Up until just a few years ago, they tended up to 200 yak at the nunnery. So a new nun would join and she would have to look after those yak for 2 years. And she would be learning to read at the same time. She'd live in a room with a couple of older nuns. She would be doing some of the cooking, boiling the water, pouring tea during the pujas, and learning to read under the tutorials of these older nuns. And at the nunnery, they read a lot. I mean, on average, they'd be reading 5 to 9 hours a day. They're mostly Drupchen texts and Yidam texts and practice texts. They're sort of describing visualizations and instructing them and guiding them in their meditation practices. But again, they're reading all day long. So it's quite interesting that these nuns who are so literate in terms of reading, their knowledge never becomes heady or intellectual. They're very down to earth, kind of very human in the ways that they learn. So first thing again is that they learn to read. So while they're looking after the yak, you'll often see them on the hillside learning to read their texts. And then they start to learn some of the ritual instruments and the mudras and the principles of the Drupchens and the group rituals and the Yidam practices. And then as soon as they can, they'll enter the 3-year retreat center, which is the picture on the lower left of the screen with the nuns with the long hair. And usually they join that 3-year retreat center when they're about 17, maybe 18 years old, maybe later in their 20s or even 30s, if they've been on a waiting list, because there's often a waiting list for the retreat center. They join the 3-year retreat. And what's unusual about the Gebchak 3-year retreat is that they learn the subtle body yogas from day 1 of the retreat. So they're learning the tsalung, or like the prana and nadi practices, which is also known as tumo. When it becomes full-blown practice, it's known as tumo. They're learning that from day 1 of the retreat. In most 3-year retreats, one would learn that in the 3rd year. In Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche's retreat manual, that comes up in the 3rd year generally. But Gebchak Nunnery is very much a full-time tantric practice tradition. So by the end of the 3-year retreat, the nuns are quite competent in those tsalung yoga practices. So that's tunkor and tsalung. So the tunkor is like a very vigorous hatha yoga, where they're kind of extending their arms and legs and doing very vigorous postures to really forcefully clear the nadi. And that's followed by the more subtle breathing, holding the breath visualization practices like the tumo practice that they do. So they're competent in that yoga. And then they're also competent in the Yidam ritual practices. So the pictures at the bottom are both the nuns in the 3-year retreat. You can see that they look very happy. When they come out of the 3-year retreat, they enter one of 16 retreat divisions. And they will live in one of those divisions for the rest of their life. That will be where they sleep every night. And generally speaking, the nuns, from the time of entering the 3-year retreat, they sleep and live in a meditation box for their whole life, and often until they pass away. Sometimes if they get very sick, they won't stay in the meditation box. But the 16 retreat divisions are each dedicated to a different Yidam, or a tantric meditational deity. And they're following mostly Mahayoga, Nyingma Tantras. So they're Yidam like Hayagriva, Black Vajrayogini like Troma. There's Tara, Amitayus, and so on, Guru Tokpo and that sort of thing. And so the nuns will choose their retreat division, usually in consultation with the Lama. The Lama might ask her what she feels. The Lama might, choose a dough ball out of a pot, and there'll be a name of Yidam, and that will be her karmic destiny. Sometimes it's a matter of which retreat division has space in it, or maybe where her aunt or her older sister is. And then she'll choose that retreat division. So within the retreat divisions, each nun will maintain at least one full session of Yidam practice every day. And that will be about 2 hours. When there's a Drupchen happening, they would do that early in the morning or in the evening, and then be in the Drupchen for the rest of the day. Often they'll be doing a tsalung session in the basement of the retreat division's building every day. And so it's sort of all integrated. The yogas and the tantric and the Yidam is all integrated. So there's definitely a saying about Gebchak Nunnery that the nuns like to tell, that the lamas of the past would say, oh, when you look at Gebchak Nunnery, there's not much to look at. It doesn't look like a very great place to be. But once you live there, it's a very happy place. The nuns like to tell you that. And really many of those nuns are exemplary of that. They're really very genuinely happy. And actually very confident as well. So I lived in 3 nunneries, and in India, 1 in Nepal for just a few months. And then a little bit I've spent some time at Gebchak. And these nuns are really the most genuinely confident nuns that I have encountered. And they'll say things like, oh, we know that the monks have better food and nicer physical conditions, but once you've got access to Dharma practice, we're happy, and we've got that here. And many of the nuns have taken vows, especially the nuns that came in the 1980s. They've taken vows to live their whole life at the nunnery and to never leave. And there are a few nuns that in fact have never left the nunnery. Like they might have gone to the Monlam, the yearly prayer festival, which is about a 2-hour drive, but that's together with the nuns, and that's part of the nunnery practice. But there's a couple of nuns I met that have literally never left. And they'll say things like, there's nowhere else I want to be. And I'll ask them, do you want to go on pilgrimage? Do you feel like going to Mount Kailash? And they'll say, yeah, there was a time I really wanted to do that. And sometimes I'd like to do that, but, you know, and they'll look up at the sky and they'll say, but everything is here. It's all here. They have access to the most sacred in their own practice, in a community that's entirely dedicated to that kind of training and orientation. And then many of the nuns will pray to be reborn at Gebchak Nunnery. So when it comes to the kind of learning, what the main theme of their learning is Buddha nature. And Buddha nature for them, it's not taught as a philosophical topic. It's not something that they analyze. It's taught and it's learned by the nuns as something to be experienced in their practice. And so, of course, Buddha nature, you know, they're like, you know, there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of study, there's a lot of discussion and education around Buddha nature. And the general definition in Tibetan texts is that it's empty of essence, it's clear by nature or knowing by nature, and it's all pervadingly compassionate. So that's the definition. You know, Ju Mipam Rinpoche, many of his texts are dedicated to establishing Buddha nature and discussing the self-empty and the other empty. You know, so a lot can be thought about, a lot can be talked about. But these Gebchak nuns, not being scholars, if you ask them to explain it in philosophical terms, first of all, they would shirk. They would always say, oh, I don't know anything. Please ask somebody who knows better. But when you spend enough time with them as people, like in a casual way, the depth of their knowledge of Tantra is really very inspiring and very juicy, very helpful. The way they can read you like a book, the way they can give advice to people, the way they can assess a situation, the way they can just see things sort of through a realized tantric experience is really marvelous. So there are all these sort of ideas about Buddha nature and teachings about Buddha nature, but at Gebchak Nunnery, it's taught to them in a very pithy style. And so they're reading every day, and it will come across to them through the texts. It will be taught to them by lamas who visit and are teaching them teachings like Words of My Perfect Teacher or the Gyu Lama, the Uttara Tantra. Every now and then, on a kind of casual basis, a lama or a khenpo might visit and teach them about Buddha nature from a text, or they might learn a little bit of Shantideva's Bodhisattva's way of life. And then they get a lot of the pith pointing out instructions from lamas that visit, and also from the older nuns. And so generally speaking, you know, like that pith instruction is like what we see on the screen here. So if you are not Buddha, where else could it be found? Your own mind is the originally pure Dharmadhatu. You are the Buddha and no one else. And that's from Tsayen Gyamtso, who was the founder of the nunnery. And let yourself become that space that welcomes any experience without judgment. Tsoknyi Rinpoche. The only position from which you can fall is the awakened state, Do Khyentse Rinpoche. And so it's really something that it's almost just like a reminder. And really, in a nutshell, the nuns will keep saying, my J, my ying, my ying. So don't be distracted, just remember. Don't be distracted, remember. And it's this constant pointing back to the here and now, constant pointing back to that basic awareness nature of the mind, the basic nature of being. Because in a Buddhist context, when we're talking about the nature of reality, of course, the nature of reality is not something other than the nature of existence. It's the nature of our being. And it's something that we realize as a human being through experience of our own nature. You know, we have this fundamental habit of turning away, according to Tantra. And in our practice, that fundamental habit of looking somewhere else, even for a particular meditation state or some experience in our practice. We're always looking for Buddha nature, for Rigpa, for that experience of enlightenment. We're always looking for it in something. And of course, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, when he was asked about why it can be so few people realize enlightenment, and he said, because he figures it's just because it's so easy, that it's so close to home and so utterly easy and simple that we look too far. So this is really the theme of the nunnery. This is the type of learning. This is the education that the nuns get. So they're very fortunate, clearly, to be a part of such a tradition. It's just this constant reminder. And it's so interesting how easy to forget it is. You know, I'm sure many of us have had the pointing out, if not all of us have had the pointing out instructions a number of times. I've been fortunate to translate for lamas who give the pointed out instructions like a number of times, yet I keep forgetting it. I just have to hear it over and over and over again. So that habit of just turning away and looking elsewhere. But for the Gebchak nuns, it's the whole point and premise and plenum of everything they do at the nunnery. And there's that other saying that's common to practice lineages that the nuns like to tell us is Chikshe Kundrol in Tibetan, which is knowing one thing, all knowing is liberated. And there was a time when there was some Khenpos from Ladungar, I believe, and some Gebchak lamas that organized a big training seminar at Gebchak Nunnery. So branch nuns and even some yogis, because there's some male yogis in the tradition as well, that there could be a big gathering at Gebchak for the nuns to teach the Drupchen rituals and the yogas and the practices of Gebchak Nunnery. And this happened over a six week period, about 4 years ago at Gebchak Nunnery. There were some Khenpos there and nuns from bigger nunneries where they study. And there started to be this conversation where these visitors from the scholastic centers wanted to have a kind of exam at the end of the seminar where they could compare the kind of Gebchak approach with other Nyingma traditions, and they could compare and contrast and sort of analyze and really sort of hash out intellectually the learning. And I was listening to these nuns talking with some of their lamas over soup that night, just next to a kind of stove, very casual conversation. And they were having this talk, and some of the most profound things that they talk about just happens in very casual settings. And they were saying, but this isn't the way we learn at Gebchak Nunnery. Our way of learning is direct, it's experiential. The whole point is that it's embodied, that it's something that you know through your embodied practice of it. This is not our tradition. And they kind of pushed back against that request for the exam at the end, and then they never had it. But that kind of shows some of the shift of values and the shift of culture around practice lineage communities in Eastern Tibet nowadays, probably across the world nowadays. And the nuns, you know, it's very, very down to earth. So there was once, these nuns will be constantly with their mala, constantly doing mantras. So they're learning Buddha nature. They're doing a lot of meditation. They have trek through holes on the side of the mountain where they look out to the sky, and they're doing silent Dzogchen meditation. And then they have their Tsalung practice, and then they have their Yidam practice. But really, the main kind of sort of the structure, or if we're thinking about the way that they learn is like a human, it's very embodied. They're learning in a human way. We could almost use it as an analogy that the skeleton or the bones of their tradition is Yidah practice. So they have those 16 retreat divisions. Even when they're doing a Dzogchen meditation and they've meditated and they're doing a silent meditation, for a Gebchak nun, that will almost always be introduced with a short guru yoga practice. So they would be visualizing the guru dissolving into their heart, and they would then do Dzogchen. So the non-conceptual meditation is very integrated with a Yidah practice, with the tantric visualization and the conceptual practice, which is something interesting because nowadays we talk about mindfulness in the West and how similar is it to Buddhist meditation. There's a lot of science of Tibetan meditation and trying to give these conceptual frameworks for it. But once you've isolated a meditation, once you've isolated a silent mindfulness or even Dzogchen style of non-conceptual meditation, it's out of context. And what we see from this example of this nunnery is that, you know, everything's in context. It's in a human context. It's in the context of a world that you live in. And for these nuns, their Dzogchen realization would always be in the context of the blessing and the energy that they receive through a guru yoga practice and through their first person Yidah meditation. So they learn about, okay, your nature is Buddha. It's clear and knowing by nature, but it's empty. And they spend a lot of time in the beginning being told to go off into the hillside, being told to go off into their meditation boxes to try and find their mind. They have to work really hard at that in the beginning. So they have to get to that emptiness understanding by, okay, what color is your mind? Where is it? You feel like the mind is so real and it's there. We experience everything. But what is it? Where is it? Find it. This is the preliminary to the pointing out instruction. And Tibetans will be asked to do a lot of that. And it's hard work. And that's like the groundwork that they'll do. So they really experience it. You can't find your mind. You know, it's that emptiness and appearance union. It's just empty. You can't find it anywhere. So in that sense, it's not real. Yet we experience it so vividly and it functions and it is very real. So it's this real cognitive dissonance, this paradox of existence and non-existence that really is beyond concept. So, you know, that's the cognitive orientation. But in terms of experiencing that Buddha nature as a human being, the main skeleton, the main framework for that is the Yidah. Because we're human beings and we have obstacles, we have challenge, we have a very complicated mind and conditioned concepts in our mind and projections. So the Yidah meditation is something that they call on as a person. It's almost like it is a personification of Buddha nature. And the way that they'll understand it, that we're meant to understand it in Tantric Buddhism, is not as a deity. So it's not meant to be something out there. I mean, it's understood as very real. A Yidah is something it's a very real Buddha, and it has a very real power, but it's not out there. It's something that we are. You know, our nature is the Yidah. So if you're doing, you know, if you have a higher tantric empowerment as Tara, of course, you're supposed to have the divine pride that one is Tara, one is Amitayus. And that's also real, but it's not inherently existing. It's not something you can ever find. It's that mirror-like way of existing. So it's quite a kind of rarefied, correct understanding to have. And I wonder too, when these nuns first join, because that's quite a sophisticated understanding of a deity, you know? And of course, Tibetans believe in mountain gods and deities and nagas and spirits all over their world. So when a young nun joins, she'll first, you know, she'll be practicing a Yidah from the beginning, but her correct understanding of her own nature, her own Buddha nature being that Yidah. It's not just an idea. It's not just nothing. It's not just space. That clear knowing, all-pervadingly compassionate nature that is Buddha nature is the Yidah when it's personified as a human. For these Gebchak nuns, that's really how they experience it. So their Dzogchen and their Yidah practice are so integrated. The generation and the completion stage are so integrated in this full tantric tradition. And so they learn this sophisticated understanding really by doing it, by participating in a community, by watching older nuns, by the very subtle signals of nuns who are more experienced, the conversations that are had, some of the formal instructions that are given, the instructions in their texts, and just doing it over and over and over again every day throughout their lives as a nun, as a practitioner. So it's really quite interesting to see, it's so difficult for us in the modern world because there's so many subtle reasons why our brains and our mind are different. And you actually do see Yidah practice as being quite diluted in Western Tibetan Buddhism. At least that's what I've observed. Even for me, quite frankly, like to negotiate faith and pure vision. And to some extent, it took me a long time to really bring the Yidah practice into my heart in a way that I wanted to practice it, in a way that it really made sense for me. It took me a long time. And it was really the Gebchak community that helped me get there. I find it very hard to grapple with faith and pure perception sometimes, especially with Tibetan Buddhism going through various scandals with our teachers and, being entered into a post-Christian, sometimes puritanical worldview and different political systems and just a completely different world. It's quite challenging. But the Yidah practice, there's a really good podcast that a neuroscientist called Maria Kozhevnikov does with Andrew Holacek. And I'll link it to you, Pema, and you can maybe share it with people. It's very worth listening to. And she just talks about the arousal states of meditation. So when we're doing a Yidah practice sort of cognitively and the access to metacognition and higher awareness that it facilitates. And she did a lot of studies, I actually helped her with some of this. She did a lot of studies about completion stage meditation, or just sort of Mahamudra or Dzogchen without a Yidah practice or a guru devotion practice preceding it. And then a completion stage, Dzogchen or Mahamudra meditation in the context of a sadhana, in the context of a generation, and then completion stage. And they're really quite different in the mind body, like in the physiological, the heart rate, the frontal cortex, the heat. So sort of the more arousal of the energy, which facilitates, higher levels of awareness, is really supported by Yidah practice, according to these neuroscience studies. So it's compelling. And these drupchans that the nuns spend half of their year doing are also Yidah practices. So they're embodying that through costume, self-visualization, the chanting, the ritual instruments, some of the cham dances that they do. And then the mandala at the center will have the bumpa, the vase at the center with the essence of the deity. And there'll be a thread, a cord tied from that bumpa at the center of the mandala that comes out and then is tied to the Vajra, that the Vajra master who leads the ritual, she's holding that Vajra and it's attached to her heart. So there's that direct thread between the Buddha and your own Buddha nature, that kind of looping effect, of empowerment through the whole drupchen. And when that Vajra master goes to bed at night, there'll be a group of nuns that will maintain the practice throughout the night, and they'll take over that Vajra and hold the cord. So the Yidah is really like the body of that Dzogchen realization for these nuns. When we come to a tantric community like Gebchak or any tradition, it's really like a magical worldview, for lack of a better word. Magic is maybe not the best word, but I struggle to find one sometimes. It's really that kind of pre-modern worldview where the microcosm of the body of the practitioner and the macrocosm of the whole cosmos is profoundly interdependent and reflect each other. And of course, this becomes very literal in Buddhist Tantra, where the nadi, sometimes the rivers of the landscape and the mountains, are seen as chakras or nadi. And these can even reflect the body of the yogi. And there are those stories of great yogis that were able to stop an eclipse or be able to tell when an eclipse would happen just through the subtle experience of their subtle body. And that's very much the worldview that these nuns have and that pre-modern Tibetans had. The nuns do a practice every year where they go up onto the mountaintops and they do rito, which is a big smoke offering ceremony to the mountain gods, and that's along with the protectors. So it's very interesting, like their mountain gods, the nature spirits, and their protector practice, they usually do together, and you start to see that the melodies of the chanting become more melodic and a bit more creative when they're doing these protector and mountain god practices. So Tibetan protectors, originally were local nature spirits that Guru Rinpoche and other tantric practitioners sort of harnessed for Vajrayana. So they are profoundly connected with the landscape, with nature. And it just really points again to our connection with nature and how important that is to us as a tantric practitioner. So this is a very interesting sign up at the top left here. It says, there's a time when people were dumping a lot of dogs at the nunnery because the nuns would feed them. And it says, to all of the faithful people living in the area, kindly do not dump your dogs here at the nunnery. For if you do, we will have to call on the wrath of the Dharma protectors. And as we do not want that kind of harm done to you or anybody else, please take heed and don't dump your dogs here at the nunnery. That sign is for all the people living in the area. So it just means like everybody in the area would have believe in that kind of thing. That's their worldview, that the protectors are real. It's an enchanted landscape, and they are profoundly a part of it. We're profoundly connected as a whole. These are little images of yakshas on the bottom left, which are also nature spirits. Yaksha is an Indian word. They were really important in ancient Indian religion, and they're very much incorporated in the Tibetan tantric worldview. They can kind of be like little elemental helpers when propitiated correctly. So the nuns in the boundary around the nunnery, there are a lot of effigies and little rituals that they'll do to keep the land spirits and the spirits of the world at peace and harmonious with the intentions of the nunnery. The nuns will be doing their mantra throughout the day. When they're farming their barley fields, they're doing mantra. When they're telling jokes over soup, they might be like talking, but still almost doing mantra kind of under their breath in between sentences, or when they're listening to somebody. It's just the constant soundtrack of their waking lives, that Yidah practice. It's just very much integrated. One nun came in and I was trying to meditate in a guest room, and she sat down, and I was like trying to meditate, so taking it quite seriously. And she sat down next to me and picked up my phone, and she just started looking at my phone and all my photos. So there's no kind of private public division there. Like you don't have real private space in a nunnery like that. And she just sort of interrupted me in my meditation. She said, how well is your meditation? And I just, I said, well, I really like the teacher about Buddha nature from one Gebchak Lama that's been very experiential. And she leaned in and she leaned in and she said, oh yeah, experiential. All Buddha nature pervades all sentient beings. It was like she really understood. Buddha nature pervades all sentient beings. It is the foundation, the ground of our being for all sentient beings, and it's always there. And she's telling me about meditation, and she's talking about Buddha nature, and she starts to show me pictures on her phone. She was one of the bursars, the nirpas for the nunnery. So she'd been given a phone for shopping. And she was showing me all these pictures on her phone of the barley fields and of her trip to town shopping, and, talking to me also about Buddha nature and meditation. And then she said, we at Gebchak Nunnery, it takes us time, but we get to a point where we have that really spacious, open understanding of the nature of our mind. And it's really happy, she said. And it just really kind of showed how integrated their practice and their understanding is with just daily barley fields and phones and life is. And nuns can be quite frank. They'll say when they first joined that it was difficult to live all together like that, and they struggled with their mind. They'd had some suffering in life before they joined, probably some depression and anxiety and the types of labels we have for that sort of thing in the West. But they'll say, but as they kept getting that pointing out instruction, that Buddha nature reminder, and they just kept turning back, bringing it home. into and relaxing in practice and trusting that it's there and experiencing it, they really do gain that proverbial Buddhist inner freedom, these nuns, and they're quite stunning in how happy they are. Just to show a bit about how they learn. So along with, the texts and the daily life, at times you'll have formal teaching. So lamas will come and again teach a text from time to time, but they also have their gurus. So here, if you can see with my cursor, I'm trying to circle him. He's got the dreadlocks. He's an older yogi under the umbrella. His name is Pemadrime. He was a great master and one of the root gurus for the Gebchak nuns. He lived in a cave about 5 kilometers away from the nunnery, and he had quite a big community of mostly nuns around him in full-time yogic practice. And one day, this was in 2006, before they had phones, one day he just rocked up on his horse and kind of came over the pass and down the hill, and suddenly the nuns saw their guru approaching, and they very quickly got the mats out and cooked the lunch, got the kettles boiling and the tsampa and the butter all arranged. And they all just sat around this yogi on the grass for the whole day. And the yogi was telling stories, and he was talking about other masters, probably about the Cultural Revolution. At times the nuns were all crying, and at times they were all laughing, and it was like storytelling. But throughout that day, he was always bringing it back to that pith instruction, that Buddha is nothing other than the nature of your own mind. Don't keep looking for it elsewhere. Like that was always being transmitted. And it was a picnic, so it was a joyful event, something just very enjoyable, nothing too serious. This is a beautiful image taken by Katerina Dorje. This was in 2010. And this yogi is Pema Dorje, who was another very important teacher for the Gebchak nuns. He passed away about 4 years ago, and he managed to survive in a cave throughout the Cultural Revolution. I think he was harassed a bit. His dreadlocks were pulled a bit by the Red Army, but he was left alone on the most part. So he maintained his retreat practice throughout his whole life, and a real relic of the old world. So this nun on the right, she came to visit him. None of this was planned in advance. Things in Tibet often were not planned in advance. She showed up and she sat down on her knees in front of this yogi, and she just started singing verses of supplication, very heartfelt and kind of sorrowful, asking him to point out the nature of her mind. So she was singing, maybe she had these verses memorized from a Drupchen or something, but they came very spontaneously. She sang these verses, and then the two of them sat in silence for about 15 minutes. And that was the instruction, that was the transmission. And so something really came across in that. And I think, as much as we can talk about Buddha nature and about Dzogchen, we all know, and of course it's something that's beyond thought and beyond verbal expression. It's something that can be that is really profound to the level of silence, and that's something that can be transmitted even as a lineage transmission through silence. So a lot of reasons that a lot of the nuns also joined when they were young because of the example of the older nuns. So I mentioned that after the Cultural Revolution, there were about 60 older nuns that had survived the Cultural Revolution. And those 60 nuns were about 67 years old in the 1980s. So gradually they passed away. And the last older nun here on the left with that lovely smile, toothless grin, she passed away in 2020, of January 2020. So she was the last old nun. But the younger nuns grew up with these old nuns, and they grew up with the example of these old nuns in life, but also how they died. And in most cases, definitely in most cases, these nuns stayed in tukdam. And I'm just assuming all of you are very familiar with these words. So tukdam is that, at death, the vital signs stop, the heart and the breath has stopped, but often for days, up to 7 days, There can be warmth at the heart, pliancy of the flesh, often a floral smell, a fragrance, and just a presence still in the body. And these nuns would often stay in Tukdam for a few days, sometimes shrink as a so-called partial rainbow body. But before they died, these old nuns would often call some of the nuns in their retreat division around them and give away anything they owned and say, don't be sad, remember your practice, turn your mind to your practice, don't be sad. And often would have a vision of their yidam, a vision of Tara or a vision of Guru Rinpoche or Yeshit Tsogel or something, and they would die and just become absorbed in that. And that's, we hear about it, and if we're fortunate, we've come close to that. But these nuns at Gebchak would see it, once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. That's probably as compelling as it gets, to motivate us to want to try and practice. So these nuns were really in practice, these nuns have been the lineage holders for the Gebchak tradition at the nunnery. And I should really clarify that when I say Gebchak, I'm talking about the nunnery, because Gebchak is actually, it's got those branch communities, those branch nunneries and a few branch monasteries. So Gebchak's also a much broader community of monks and nuns and lay male yogis, some cases lay female yogis, but mostly lay male yogis. Centered in different communities. So when it comes to the nunnery, these elderly nuns, after the Cultural Revolution, they taught the Dzogchen. There was one nun that knew that had remembered and continued to practice at Salung. So she was the main Salung teacher. There was one nun that was sort of specialized in the ritual. She'd memorized a lot of the Drupchens and the ritual. There was one nun that was particularly good in Dzogchen. There was one nun that kind of had the administrative practice really memorized or really incorporated in her experience. So all the pieces were there. And there was one older nun that really, at the risk of her life, had taken the collection of Gebchak texts. And those Gebchak texts were 16 volumes by the founder, and then Ratnalingpa's 25 termas. So not a whole lot of texts, but enough to fill 2 big sacks of sheepskin. She took them and she buried them underground in a poor farmer's field. And a poor farmer would not have been targeted during the Cultural Revolution, so that seemed the safer place. And it was very risky for her to do that. And then in 1976, when Mao Zedong passed and they were allowed to reconvene with their communities, their religious communities, she went back and unearthed all these texts and brought them back on a yak, put on her best robes, had a shower, and offered them back to the Gebchak lamas. So it was really all of these old nuns that brought all the pieces of the tradition together, and then in practice have given the teaching. So you'll see young nuns sitting outside of the temple, and an older nun might be sitting there with them and asking them for gyutlen, which is to explain their experience in meditation. So if the nuns do have a measurement or an examination system, it's largely done through gyutlen, which is through demonstration. So they might have to demonstrate their yoga practices, but often they have to describe, offer the description of their meditation experience, what they're finding in their meditation. And then the older nun would sort of tweak it, and the male lamas will do the same. You've got in practice lineages, the 3 main lines of transmission are the Wang, the Lung, and the Trika. So the Wang are those tantric empowerments. The Lung are the oral transmission of the texts, and the Trika are the pith instructions, the pointing out instructions of meditation. We can see clearly those are all experiential. They require the experienced presence of a person. They're personalized. Interestingly, at Gebchak Nunnery, the nuns are very capable of transmitting the Trika, those nonverbal, those purely experiential those purely experiential instructions or guidance, forms of guidance in meditation. The nuns are very capable and do that. But when it comes to anything text-based, anything written, so the Wang or the Lung, which both depict the empowerments, the Wang or the Lung, the oral text transmission, which are dependent on written text, those lines of transmission are always given by a male, a lama. So there is still a double standard there, gender-wise. But the nuns, for them, these Gebchak nuns feel very fortunate, and it doesn't factor into their identity really I haven't seen gender really factor into their identity. I'm sure it is a real factor, but in terms of their conscious identity, gender isn't something that's salient for them. Yeah, these nuns are just extraordinary human examples of warmth and compassion. If you've been fortunate to go there, and I know some of you here have been fortunate to visit Gebchak Nunnery and the Gebchak nuns, you'll know that they're quite cheerful and they're very warm, and they're very approachable. They'll hold your hand, they'll sit next to you, they'll try and help you to get what you need, and they're just really beautiful, and they ask you a lot of questions. And this is Anilama Shirobzangmo. So she passed away around 2000, maybe 16 or 14. But she was the nun that really had the Dzogchen realization, and she was quite renowned among lamas of her day, like, quite renowned. And she doesn't, she was very decrepit. She was very physically ill. She wasn't able to stand up for the last 5 years of her life. Physically she was very sick, but and many of the old nuns would say, oh, I don't feel any sickness. I don't feel any sickness. I feel fine. And she would just be absolutely centered in the nature of her mind at all times. And their gaze, some of the Gebchak nuns, their gaze is a sure sign, like they're so stable in the nature of mind realization. Now, because those older nuns have passed, if we come down to the younger nuns, we've got on our left here, giving us the peace sign, that's Anilama Chemchok, and she's one of 2 nun Dorje Lopons, or Vajra masters, and she leads all of Gebchak's major ritual ceremonies. So she sits on the thrones during the Drupchen. She'll hold the Vajra with the cord attached to it. She's got real gravitas, this woman. She's almost sweet. I wouldn't describe her as sweet. I'd say she's very warm and very humble, very approachable, but she's got a real magnetism about her, a real power about her. And she also cuts up the bodies of deceased nuns for sky burials, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition of her very warm and approachable character. And she's cutting up the bodies of nuns that were her friends, or often her own teachers. And the Gebchak nuns' last wish is often for their body to be offered to the vultures, because it's their last act of generosity. And sky burial in Tibet just made sense practically, because the land was permanently frozen and not a lot of wood. It was a very high altitude region, so not a lot of wood for burning. So the nuns would always offer the bodies to the vultures. And this nun, Chemchok, she said, when my brother died, or when my parents died, I didn't feel the grief I feel for when the Gebchak nuns, for those older Gebchak nuns die, because those Gebchak nuns had made that vow for the sake of all sentient beings. They were motivated for the goodness of all sentient beings. And so their passing felt like such a loss to her, whereas her brother and her parents, while she loved them, their motivation was really more self-centered. So, and then she would have to cut up their bodies. This is a picture of the sky burial at the nunnery. So they actually have their own sky burial site, charnel ground, which is just up one of the hills. And this picture was just taken a few months ago. One of the old male yogis passed away, and they had his sky burial. So Chemchok, the nun we just saw in the previous photo, she said, oh, at Gebchak Nunnery, we don't have much. All we've got is tsampa. We've just got tsampa. We've just got the barley flour to eat. We don't have a lot of good food, and it's not very comfortable here, but we've got happiness. We've got happiness. And this is a picture of them. So they're very much about enjoying life. So this is a picnic that wasn't supposed to break. Wasn't supposed to break. It's tug of war. And that would have been after the main Drupchen, the Kabge Drupchen that they do in summer. They have an annual summer picnic. If we come up to the present day, because of mandatory education, all school-age children now must go to central schools. So what you see happening is a lot of very young girls are sent to the nunnery by local families, almost as a kind of cultural catchment. They're sent to the nunnery to absorb their Buddhist culture, to learn to read Tibetan, to get the blessings of the nunnery and those nuns. But for most of these young little nunlets here, they will have to leave. By the time they're 8 or 9 years old, or probably earlier, they'll have to go to school. So they'll move back to town. A few of them get off the radar, but usually that doesn't work. So it's changing world. So what I've just described, what the stories I've just shared, and the world that we've just had a glimpse into is really one of an old world. They're still living like that, but there are a lot of challenges. So there's a law across in the Constitution of China, and it's been there for like 100 years or longer, that one should not become ordained as a monk or a nun until you're 18 years old. So it's not just targeting Tibetans. That's been for Buddhist Mahayana across China for a long, long time. And so by the time you're 18 in China nowadays, you've most likely gone to school for 9 years. And the nature of education in China is very hyper modern and materialist. It's about becoming a successful market actor. So their value system is completely changing. And it just means that we'll see a lot fewer nuns being able to live their lives at Gebchak Nunnery. It's also interesting, you see Tibetans suffering from altitude sickness. And it seems when they start, because the centers of the economy and the centers of the hospitals and the schools and trade links are now at lower altitudes. So you have these small little urban centers now throughout Nangchen, where most of the nuns' families now have a home, and any kids going to school will be living there. And actually, you've also seen over the last 10 years, most of the big monasteries that used to be at much higher altitudes, like Gebchak, have rebuilt themselves at lower altitudes in order to remain linked to society, as they always have been. But it's a new world, it's a new value system. And so you see when the nuns and their lamas are going up and down to Gebchak into town and up and down the altitude on a regular basis, then they start to get altitude sickness. So go figure. But it means that for some of the nuns, they're simply not healthy up at the nunnery anymore. So there's a lot of adaptations. One of the Gebchak lamas has built a retreat, a hermitage, a retreat center across the river from town at a much lower altitude, and kind of envisioning that as the future hub of the wider Gebchak lineage. And as it's got a 3-year retreat training center, that's kind of a long-term vision to try and keep this going, make it all survive. And then also the nuns, and I mentioned that they used to be quite renowned in the region for the quality of their tantric experience and their practice. But more recently, they've been criticized by Tibetans for not studying enough. So other Tibetan monks and nuns often will be the ones to criticize the Gebchak nuns that they do so many drupchins and they do these higher tantric yogas and higher tantric practices, but they don't study enough. So how can they know what they're doing? So you can really see again that shift in orientation, because actually the Gebchak nuns have not changed what they've been doing for 120 plus years now. But the world around them is changing so much. And of course the nunnery is changing too, but their schedule has not changed, what they spend their life doing. Anyway, so all of this really just, this is just a quick picture of Sri Singha Shedra, which is down at Dzogchen Monastery. So one of the 6 great Nyingma monasteries. This is a recent photo from a Nyingma monastery and the Shedra there. And it's a real contrast to the Gebchak style of learning. This is a Shedra, they would have memorized and they're writing exams. It'd be critical thinking and comparative analysis of Buddhist texts and commentaries and establishing their intellectual understanding of emptiness. Again, telling these stories of the nuns and the Gebchak example is by no means suggesting to us that we shouldn't study and that we should be trying to do things like the Gebchak nuns. That's probably not realistic for us. And it's not necessarily the best thing for each of us. It's up to each one of us to find the approach that works best. And for many of us, that scholastic approach is quite supportive and can really help to clear our view. But what these stories and what this nunnery really, I think, can do, and what I've aimed to share here, is just a reminder of the Buddha nature, that cardinal principle in any tantric knowledge, in all of our practices. It's the ground, it's the foundation of the foundation path and fruition. It's that fundamental nature of mind, which when it's realized, it's called Rigpa, it's called Dharmadhatu, it's called Dharmata, but the experience is one of that Buddha nature. And it's something that, as we can see with the Gebchak nuns, is simply a matter of remembering. Just looking back, just coming home, without having to worry about anything really, because it's our nature. We don't have to attain it. We don't have to change anything. We simply need to relax into it and practice. So that's the end of the slideshow. I'm going to stop sharing. And at this point, I'm just going to look to the chat to see if there are any questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with the chat questions and then ask. There's one question in the chat. And if anybody wants to ask a question, just please put your hand up or speak up. I'd be really happy to hear it. Can Western women visit the nunnery and do courses or retreats here? So Western women are most welcome to visit the nunnery. I mean, right now, China's inaccessible because of the COVID restrictions, so we can't visit China for that reason. But in more normal times, yeah, you're most welcome to visit the nunnery, and the lamas endeavor to, you know, make that possible through, you know, guided visits and stuff. The nunnery, however, does not offer short courses or retreats, and there's a few reasons for that. Mainly because they're so remote and traditional, and they've not really traveled very far beyond the nunnery, so they're not very aware of, you know, Tibetan Buddhist adaptations around the world, and for the Western mind, they don't speak any other language than their very local dialect, which is not even like a Pan-Tibetan dialect. It's a very remote dialect. And then they're full-time practicing. So the nuns are not in a particular position to be offering short courses to Western women, but, you know, they're certainly very welcoming when you go. But the Gebchak lamas do offer courses and retreats along the experiential lines, you know, the kind of approach that Gebchak takes. There's some opportunities to learn in their tradition, and that retreat center that's built at a lower altitude across the river, that's a large part of that retreat center is for Westerners and international students of these lineages to come and do practice. So you can keep in touch with me, or there are a couple of websites that I'll link with Pema that you can follow up if you're interested. And then Yeshe Rigzen, I will try and unmute you here. Just a second.
I've got myself unmuted.
Oh, thank you. That was easy.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just really interested in, I guess, first of all, the way that the nuns practice, and that it is a very, am I right in saying tantric, experiential way of practice?
Yeah.
And that when it comes to just I guess it was what you were coming around to at the end, where there's this comparison, you know, that there's temptation to compare, and that where that belongs, I guess. Like, you know, if there's a group of people who are getting a lot out of their practice, the way they're doing their practice, it's personal, it's meaningful, so that's good.
That's absolutely good. Yeah. No, I really don't mean to be, you know, communicating that these nuns are doing it, you know, the way that we should be doing it. You know, really, you know, trying to emphasize that, you know, we all live in different worlds, and what we're doing has to be in context. And these nuns live in a very different world, which is really, you know, not our world at all. So for us, you know, to compare and to study and to learn and to be maybe eclectic in our approach, at least for me, that's definitely has helped me better than just a sheer kind of soul. For me, it's encouraged the kind of open mind that I think culturally works better for me. I think all I'm trying to communicate, and I probably didn't simplify it enough, but because I get in my head quite a bit, is just the way that they understand Buddha nature. Because as far as Buddha nature is something that is meaningful to us and something that we are practicing in order to realize, the way that the nuns learn Buddha nature in that very simple, very human, very direct way, that it's who you are. It's who you are as a person. It's your own basic nature, that you just keep coming back to that.
Yeah, no, it made a lot of sense to me, because it resonated with me, because that's how I find I get the most out of my practice is, you know, as a human and and to experience it. And that sometimes, like, I think that the intellectual side of it has absolute benefit too, but to not go too far out into that place, because it's not inner wisdom.
Yeah,
that's my feeling about it anyway.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I do struggle. Well, I think, you know, my practice, and something I struggle with, but therefore make my practice, is to go too far with the intellect, because I've been educated in a modern education system largely, which is intellect, you know, in a way intellectual, you know, trying to understand things sort of objectively and intellectually. So when I you know, for a long time, I've really tried to understand things intellectually. And even in my practice, the mental consciousness is trying to, you know, understand something, and to try and that very fine, not even a line, you know, but that difference.
Yeah, and it is such an individual thing too. We are all such unique human beings, and we just have to find our own place of connection.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, most welcome.
I just wanted to add that I was really loving Yeshila's archway behind her.
Yeah.
Very nice. I have a little question. It's not a very exciting one. Is that okay?
That's most welcome.
So, institutionally, Gebchak is a Drukpa Kagyu institution. Is that right?
It would be a kind of cunning, like
Right,
Kagyu Nyingma, Drukpa Kagyu Nyingma. So the founder of the nunnery took his transmissions at Sepchu Gompa, which is a Drukpa Kagyu monastery, and Sokne Rinpoche, the first, his seat was at Sepchu Gompa, which is a Drukpa Kagyu community. But Sokne Rinpoche the first was a great, you know, Drupwang. He was a great master and a Teratun, and he was transmitting a lot of Ratnalingpa termas, which are Nyingma, clearly. So his main transmission and direction to Tsayan Gyamtso was Ratnalingpa yogas, and then Tsayan Gyamtso created 16 volumes adapting the Ratnalingpa yogas for the Gebchak community. And those are like the Ratnalingpa Terama, and those 16 adaptations of the Ratnalingpa Terama are what the nuns are practicing every day. So, you know, in the practice sense, they're very much Nyingma, but in terms of the family lineage, and it's also Drukpa Kagyu. And really, if you go to Eastern Tibet, you know, really any practice lineage, you cannot really isolate one lineage from very profound links with these other lineages. So,
yeah, and so Sangyang Gyamtso, I always have trouble with that word, was a Turton as well? Or?
Kind of. Well, some of his texts you could call mind termas. So they kind of were outpouring from his tantric meditation experience, but he wasn't technically considered a Teratun.
Okay.
No.
I have another question, which you might not be able to answer, but this is a slightly weird question. So while you've been at Gebchak with the nuns, are you aware of like any kind of like mind-to-mind transmission from the lamas past or present to the nuns that they're then implementing or documenting or keeping?
It's a good question. That they're documenting or keeping. I mean, they're certainly having transmissions from the great living masters in Tibet nowadays. So sometimes you'll see the nuns they were going to Achen Rinpoche, Yachen Gar for sometimes. And then I'm not very great with names. I've forgotten the names. I apologize. But yes, certainly I can write them down for you later, but I can't recall them right now. But yeah, definitely taking mind-to-mind transmissions, very trika, very pith instructions from the great living masters, often older masters. And then whether or not they're recording them, I don't think they're recording those transmissions per se, but they've definitely redacted their collections of text and republished their collections of texts in the last 5 to 10 years.
So they're doing their own innovation. It's kind of what I was trying to find out. That's great. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
Excellent. I shall be quiet now.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point because, lineage, that logic of lineage being practice, that innovation and that continued, what you just pointed to, that's like the life of a practice lineage. So, in Tibet now, in China nowadays, you're not allowed to build a new monastery or to establish any new tuku lines, which kind of,
goodness me,
it's interesting how that's gonna look in 20 years, how underground things might have to go. But a tuku, like a lineage, it's something that comes through practice. That's something that they evolve into a tuku as a result of practice. So.
I have another question. The trauma they do, is that Ratnalingpa lineage trauma?
That also I can look up for you. Can't tell you right now. I think it might be from Minderling. There are a few of their retreat divisions are from Minderling, Ratnalingpa, and I think one's from Namchu Nyingma. It's a real smattering of inspiration in there.
Excellent. All right. Does anyone else have questions that they would like to ask Jismala while we have her here?
I'm not sure where all of you are. I know where Tashi and John Davies are. I know where Catherine is. Catherine, how are you feeling? I hope you've had COVID there in Blacksland.
I'm much better, Chisholm. I'm on the mend, so I'm on the uphill, so that's good.
Okay,
that's nice to hear.
That's good to hear. Take care.
I think Susanna and Andreas are in Tasmania.
See, right? Yeah, stay down there.
I'm not sure where other people are. Oh, Yeshi Riggs is in Brisbane.
Nice, a bit warmer up there, maybe.
Claudia Ellis is in Chinchilla, Western Queensland.
Okay.
So people are all over the place. And there's someone here, Erin's from Gumbanga country, which is around Coffs Harbour, Dorrigo. Fantastic. Welcome, Erin.
Nice to have everybody. I guess we're all in Australia, truly in a winter. So Yonten Punsok, you're in the States, is that right? I'm sorry, you might have mentioned that at the beginning, Pema.
Oh no, I don't think I did.
I'm in the UK.
You're in the UK. Oh, so you're in the middle of summer. Is it warm there? Quite hot there still? You've had a lot of heat.
Very hot for us as Westerners.
Oh my.
So that it was 42 degrees in London a week ago or something like that. And people were really upset. And those of us in Queensland were like, that's like Tuesday, every Tuesday. Although we've had a really lovely winter. It's been nice and cool.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, it's a lovely Saturday afternoon, wherever you are, I hope. So hopefully you get a bit of sunshine and to continue to enjoy the winter school. It's been really nice to spend a bit of time with you, see your faces now, and wishing you all the best.
So before we wind up, Shuzhamala, do you want to pass the hostage back onto me?
Absolutely.
And then the recording will download onto my desktop and I'll have it here.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone. As I said the other night,